Hello, it's a joy to have you here. Today we're going to dive together into one of the most striking moments in all of sacred history. A moment when the power of God not only revealed itself but changed the course of an entire nation. Imagine an entire people camped before a city that seemed invincible. Walls wide enough for chariots to race upon them, gates reinforced with bronze, and guards standing watch on every tower. Jericho was the symbol of human strength, self-sufficiency, and idolatry. But before it stood a man who did not see with the eyes of reason, but with the eyes of faith, Joshua. He was not seeking battle strategies, nor did he fear the size of the challenge. His heart was attentive to the voice of the heavenly commander, ready to obey even when the divine plan seemed too strange for human logic. Because Joshua had already learned since the desert, since the Jordan, that when God speaks, the impossible bows. For days, the army of Israel marched in silence. No shouting, no swords raised. Only the sound of the trumpets and the steady footsteps of a people who trusted the promise. Men, women, and children looked at the same walls and saw the same obstacle. Yet within them grew something Jericho could never understand. Obedient faith. Heaven watched every step, every silence, every heartbeat. And when the appointed moment came, a command resounded. The trumpets blared louder and the cry of an entire people rose as one voice. That's when the supernatural happened. The walls fell without a single human hand touching them. That day God showed that no fortress, no matter how strong it may seem, can stand against the power of faith. Jericho fell not by the might of men, but by the presence of the Lord who fought for them. Stay with me until the end and see what God is able to do in your life too. Joshua had led the people through the crossing of the Jordan River, and now they stood before one of the greatest obstacles of their conquest, Jericho. The city rose in majesty, surrounded by thick walls and gates of bronze. For any army, that challenge would have been impossible. But Joshua did not see only walls. He saw a new field in which the faithfulness of God would act. Since the day he had taken leadership, he had learned to depend on heaven at every step. He had been with Moses on the mountain, witnessed the manna fall from above, the sea open, and water flow from the rock. Everything in his life pointed to one unshakable truth. Victory would never come from human hands, but from divine power. That night, the camp rested in silence. The wind brushed against the tents, and the distant murmur of the people blended with the sound of Joshua's footsteps as he walked alone. His thoughts were turned toward God. He was not seeking strategies of war, but spiritual discernment. He knew that before moving the army, he needed to hear from the commander of the universe. It was then that a radiant figure appeared before him. A man stood with his sword drawn, wrapped in a light that was not of this world. Joshua approached and asked firmly, "Are you for us or for our enemies?" The answer came with heavenly authority, "Neither. I have come now as the commander of the army of the Lord." Joshua understood immediately. That presence was no ordinary messenger. He fell to the ground in reverence and said, "What does my Lord say to his servant?" And the same voice that had once spoken to Moses was heard again. "Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place where you stand is holy." Before the heavenly commander, Joshua bowed in worship. Common ground became holy ground. The divine presence transformed the warrior leader into a reverent servant. The same God who had guided Israel through the wilderness now appeared to lead them in conquest. In that sacred moment, Joshua received the plan. No sword would be lifted, no attack would be made. For 6 days, the army would march around the city once each day. The Ark of the Covenant would go before them, accompanied by 7 priests blowing trumpets. On the 7th day, they would circle the city 7 times, and when the sound of the trumpets was prolonged, the people would shout. Then the walls would fall. It was a plan that defied human logic, yet Joshua did not question it. The same God who had opened the Jordan was now showing that victory would come through faith. He returned to the camp and delivered the instructions with calm conviction. "Sanctify yourselves, for tomorrow the Lord will do wonders among you." While everyone slept, Joshua remained awake, gazing toward the faint glow of Jericho in the distance. His heart was at peace. Faith had replaced every shadow of doubt. That encounter had marked him deeply. He knew that the battle had already been decided in heaven before it even began on earth. The Christian writer Ellen White explains that the presence of the commander of the Lord's army was the confirmation that it was Christ himself who led Israel. It was he who went before them and determined the path of victory. No wall could stand against the power of the living God. How many times do we too face walls that seem unbreakable, situations that make us hesitate, fears that hold us still? The secret remains the same. Kneel, listen to the eternal voice, and trust. For the same commander who stood with Joshua is still present today. When dawn touched the plains of Canaan, Joshua was already on his feet. His face reflected the serenity of one who had walked in God's presence. The plan was set, and the army was ready to march. The impossible would be conquered, not by the strength of weapons, but by the power of faith. And as the sun rose over the horizon, heaven was already moving in silence. Joshua had led the people through the crossing of the Jordan River, and now they stood before one of the greatest obstacles of their conquest, Jericho. The city rose in majesty, surrounded by thick walls and gates of bronze. For any army, that challenge would have been impossible. But Joshua did not see only walls. He saw a new field in which the faithfulness of God would act. Since the day he had taken leadership, he had learned to depend on heaven at every step. He had been with Moses on the mountain, witnessed the manna fall from above, the sea open, and water flow from the rock. Everything in his life pointed to one unshakable truth: victory would never come from human hands, but from divine power. That night, the camp rested in silence. The wind brushed against the tents, and the distant murmur of the people blended with the sound of Joshua's footsteps as he walked alone. His thoughts were turned toward God. He was not seeking strategies of war, but spiritual discernment. He knew that before moving the army, he needed to hear from the commander of the universe. It was then that a radiant figure appeared before him. A man stood with his sword drawn, wrapped in a light that was not of this world. Joshua approached and asked firmly, "Are you for us or for our enemies?" The answer came with heavenly authority, "Neither. I have come now as the commander of the army of the Lord." Joshua understood immediately. That presence was no ordinary messenger. He fell to the ground in reverence and said, "What does my Lord say to his servant?" And the same voice that had once spoken to Moses was heard again. "Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place where you stand is holy." Before the heavenly commander, Joshua bowed in worship. Common ground became holy ground. The divine presence transformed the warrior leader into a reverent servant. The same God who had guided Israel through the wilderness now appeared to lead them in conquest. In that sacred moment, Joshua received the plan. No sword would be lifted, no attack would be made. For 6 days, the army would march around the city once each day. The Ark of the Covenant would go before them, accompanied by 7 priests blowing trumpets. On the 7th day, they would circle the city 7 times, and when the sound of the trumpets was prolonged, the people would shout. Then the walls would fall. It was a plan that defied human logic, yet Joshua did not question it. The same God who had opened the Jordan was now showing that victory would come through faith. He returned to the camp and delivered the instructions with calm conviction. Sanctify yourselves, for tomorrow the Lord will do wonders among you." While everyone slept, Joshua remained awake, gazing toward the faint glow of Jericho in the distance. His heart was at peace. Faith had replaced every shadow of doubt. That encounter had marked him deeply. He knew that the battle had already been decided in heaven before it even began on earth. The Christian writer Ellen White explains that the presence of the commander of the Lord's army was the confirmation that it was Christ himself who led Israel. It was he who went before them and determined the path of victory. No wall could stand against the power of the living God. How many times do we too face walls that seem unbreakable, situations that make us hesitate, fears that hold us still? The secret remains the same. Kneel, listen to the eternal voice, and trust. For the same commander who stood with Joshua is still present today. When dawn touched the plains of Canaan, Joshua was already on his feet. His face reflected the serenity of one who had walked in God's presence. The plan was set, and the army was ready to march. The impossible would be conquered, not by the strength of weapons, but by the power of faith. And as the sun rose over the horizon, heaven was already moving in silence. The first day began with the sound of the trumpets. The tone was firm and solemn, like a call that crossed the valley and reached every heart. The people of Israel rose in silence. Each tribe took its place, and the Ark of the Covenant was set at the front. The priests took their positions. The warriors stood in formation, and the 12 tribes formed a single column, moving in perfect order. Joshua stood among them, watchful and calm, his eyes fixed on the city ahead. Before him rose the walls that challenged the faith of an entire generation. But the leader knew that this battle would not be won by strength, but by obedience. The plan had been drawn by God himself, and Joshua trusted that every detail held a divine purpose. At the signal of the priests, the trumpets sounded again. The echo spread through the valley, climbed the hills, and rolled against the walls. From the top of the towers, the guards of Jericho watched uneasy. What they saw was something they had never witnessed before. An army marching without shouting, without raising weapons, without a single cry. They simply walked. The priests went ahead, blowing the trumpets. Behind them, 7 men carried the ark, the symbol of God's presence. The army followed in silence, step after step, until the circuit around the city was complete. No attack, no threat. When the march ended, Joshua raised his hand, and the people quietly returned to the camp. On the second day, the same scene unfolded. The same sound of the trumpets, the same silence, the same solemn pace. The people of Jericho, who had mocked them on the first day, now watched in confusion. Some locked themselves inside their homes. Others climbed the towers, trying to understand. It was as if an invisible force surrounded the city and pressed its walls from within. Inside Israel's camp, the atmosphere was one of reverence. Every man knew he was taking part in something far greater than a military conquest. It was an act of collective faith. With every circuit, their hearts grew stronger in unity and trust. And though nothing seemed to happen, they knew that God was working in the unseen. On the third day, the heat was intense. The sand rose with the wind, and the sound of the trumpets blended with the rustle of the tents. Still, the people marched. No complaints, no words. It was as though silence itself had become a form of worship. With each step, faith was tested. Perhaps some wondered when the walls would fall, but no one dared to break the silence. Joshua had instructed them clearly. The miracle would happen in God's time, not theirs. Inside Jericho, despair deepened. Families slept little. Mothers hushed their children, and soldiers kept watch on the towers with trembling hearts. The priests of idols, who once promised safety, now hid in their temples. Their prayers brought no answers. Fear had become the only king within the city. On the fourth day, the sound of the trumpet seemed stronger. Each note carried a warning that judgment was near. The people of Israel no longer saw only walls. They saw a spiritual fortress being dismantled. It was as if heaven itself was bending toward them. The fifth day dawned quietly. The people marched as before, but something in the air had changed. It was the kind of stillness that comes before a great move of God. The trumpet sounded, and the echo rolled like a wave across the city. Even without visible signs, faith was growing. The silence was not empty. It was filled with purpose. Then came the sixth day. The sun rose golden over the camp, and the weary, fearful city no longer mocked. From the towers, the guards looked down in confusion. Why do they continue? Why don't they attack? What are they waiting for? Meanwhile, Joshua walked among the people. He looked at each face and saw determination. No trace of doubt, no hesitation. It was as if everyone knew that the seventh day would be different. When the march ended, the army returned to the camp in silence. The sun sank below the horizon, and the wind swayed the banners of the tribes. That evening, Joshua withdrew for a moment and knelt before the divine presence. His prayer was simple but filled with surrender. Lord, your name will be exalted. You yourself have said that you would fight for us. Tomorrow your promises will be fulfilled before all. Let our faith not fail, and let your power be revealed. The leader remained still for a moment, and the distant sound of trumpets faded into the night. In the camp the people rested, but their hearts were awake. None of them knew what the next day would bring, but all were ready to obey. The dawn of the seventh day was drawing near. The sky, still dark, seemed to wait for the sound of the trumpets. The wind swept gently over the tents, and the faith of an entire people rose with the light of a new day. What would come next would be more than a victory. It would be the testimony that the seventh day dawned before the sun had even touched the mountains. A cold breeze swept across the valley, and the camp of Israel was already awake. The priests adjusted their trumpets, the warriors armed themselves, and the people gathered around the Ark of the Covenant. The moment had come. Joshua stood before the multitude. His eyes reflected the calm of one who knew that God was about to act. No long speeches, no words of command, only the certainty that the heavenly commander, the same who had appeared before him days earlier, would once again march ahead of his people. The priests lifted their trumpets, and the sound echoed through the valley, deep, solemn, and full of power. The mountains caught the vibration, and the tribes began to move. The march had begun. The first circuit was like the previous ones, with steady steps and reverent silence. The sound of the trumpets blended with the rhythm of sandals striking the ground. From the walls, the guards of Jericho watched motionless. The people within the city no longer mocked nor shouted. Fear had replaced arrogance. The second circuit was more intense. The sun began to rise, and the dust stirred by the multitude formed a golden cloud above the plain. The trumpets sounded louder, closer, as if heaven itself were answering. By the third circuit, the silence of the people was almost supernatural. Each step was heavy with expectation. The air itself trembled with faith. The fourth brought weariness to their feet, but not to their hearts. Israel marched as one body, driven by one purpose. When they began the fifth circuit, the shadows shortened and the heat grew. Still no one stopped. Joshua walked among the priests, attentive to every detail. The sound of the trumpets did not cease. It was the sound of confidence. At the sixth circuit, the entire city was suspended in dread. Windows were closed, towers were silent. The king and his counselors, powerless, watched from the palace. All they could do was wait for what they knew was coming. Then came the seventh circuit, the long-awaited moment. The trumpets filled the air once again, stronger, longer, deeper. The warriors marched with their eyes fixed on the walls. Every step echoed the command of the Almighty. When the last priest completed the circuit, Joshua lifted his hand. The sound of the trumpet stopped for a moment. The wind ceased. Silence fell over the entire valley. Then, with a firm voice, the leader proclaimed, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city." The sound that followed was not merely the cry of a people. It was faith turned into voice. Thousands of men and women cried out together, and the shout rose like thunder. The trumpets blared again, louder than ever. The ground began to tremble. A deep sound like that of a mountain splitting filled the air. Stones began to shift, towers swayed, and before everyone's eyes, the mighty walls of Jericho began to crumble. The walls fell block by block, the city turned into dust and ruin. What once seemed impenetrable collapsed in an instant. No battering ram, no sword, no human strength had touched them. It was the power of the living God revealed before all nations. For a moment, the people stood in stunned silence. Then a new cry filled the air, this time a cry of worship. The trumpets continued to sound, and the echo of the miracle rolled through the hills. The warriors advanced through the opening. The fallen walls had formed a straight path into the heart of the city. It was as if God Himself had laid out the way. The battle began, but the victory was already decided. The sound of the trumpets mingled with the rhythm of footsteps and songs. Israel marched not with fury, but with reverence. They knew they were standing on holy ground. What was unfolding before them was not just a military conquest. It was the literal fulfillment of the promise made in the wilderness. The Christian writer Ellen White explains that the angel of the Lord, the same who had appeared to Joshua as the heavenly commander, was present in that moment, invisible to human eyes but directing every movement. The armies of heaven had brought down the walls of Jericho, and the entire universe watched in awe at the triumph of faith. From the camp, the women and children watched from afar, weeping in wonder. Every trumpet blast seemed to pierce their hearts. They knew they were witnessing something that would be told for generations. When the dust began to settle, Joshua knelt. His hands touched the ground, and he lifted his face toward heaven. No words were needed. It was the kind of prayer that has no voice, pure gratitude. Israel had conquered, but they knew they had not conquered alone. The walls of Jericho lay in ruins, but the faith of the people burned brighter than ever. The God who had opened the sea and the river had now brought down an entire city without a single human weapon. And so the promises of God continued to unfold before all who dared to believe, and the sound of the trumpets continued to echo through the valley. An eternal reminder that when God speaks, the impossible must. The sound of the trumpet still echoed through the valley as the army of Israel stepped across the ruins of the fallen walls. Dust hung in the air like a golden mist, and rays of sunlight filtering through the debris lit the path that God Himself had opened. The ground that had once been Jericho's pride now became the stage of divine victory. Joshua raised his hand, and the people advanced. The moment was solemn. Every step taken inside the destroyed city was a reminder that the power that had brought down those stones was not human. The warriors moved in order, attentive to their leader's commands. The victory belonged to God, and obedience remained the condition. The streets were silent. The people of Jericho, consumed by terror, had tried to resist, but the strength of the divine presence was irresistible. Many hid. Others ran to their temples, seeking help from gods who could do nothing. Judgment had come, and Joshua's words resounded through the air. The city and all that is in it shall be devoted to the Lord. The battle began swiftly. The gates, once shut, now lay broken. The armies of Israel entered from every direction, guided by the sound of the trumpets and the certainty of the promise. the clash of swords mixed with the reverent spirit of the people. There were no shouts of triumph, only a holy sense of purpose. Every warrior knew he was fighting not for personal glory, but to fulfill the command of God. The houses, the temples, and the palaces of Jericho were symbols of the idolatry that had corrupted Canaan. Altars to Baal and Ashtoreth filled the city. The people of Israel saw in them the reflection of a society that had turned its back on the presence of God. And now, as an act of judgment and purification, everything would be surrendered to the Lord. The Christian writer Ellen White explains that the destruction of Jericho was not merely an act of conquest, but a judgment against sin that had reached its full measure. For centuries, God had endured the rebellion of Canaan, offering time for repentance. But when the acts of injustice and depravity became unbearable, mercy gave way to justice. The fall of Jericho was, above all, a message that God is patient, but also just. Joshua watched from a distance as the people obeyed faithfully. There was no disorder, no display of pride. The warriors gathered the gold, silver, and bronze, not for themselves, but for the treasury of the Lord's house. Everything that represented idolatry would be burned, so that nothing impure would be mingled with what was holy. Fire began to rise from the ruins. The flames danced against the sky, and the scent of smoke spread through the wind. The proud and idolatrous city was now turning to ashes before the eyes of all Israel. And in the midst of that desolation, the faith of the people shone brighter than ever. With his face illuminated by the glow of the fire, Joshua lifted his voice and proclaimed before everyone, "Cursed before the Lord be the man who rises up and rebuilds this city of Jericho." It was both a warning and a memorial. The fallen city would stand as an eternal symbol of the difference between trust and rebellion, between faith and arrogance. The people gathered before the ark. The trumpets sounded again, not for war this time, but for worship. And for the first time since crossing the Jordan, the tribes could rest with peaceful hearts. God had fulfilled his promise. Children ran through the camp. The elders prayed with tears in their eyes, and the women lifted songs of gratitude. The sound of joy mingled with the crackling of the fires, still burning in the distance. Jericho had fallen, but Israel had risen in faith. That night the camp was filled with deep silence. The people slept in peace under the bright stars of Canaan. No enemy dared approach. All knew that the God of Israel was with them. Joshua, however, did not sleep early. He walked to the edge of the camp and gazed at the ruins in the distance. In his heart, he felt the weight of responsibility, but also the joy of obedience rewarded. He knew that new battles awaited, yet he also knew that the same God who had brought down Jericho's walls would continue to lead them. The faith that had sustained the people during 6 days of silence would now carry them into future victories. The leader knelt and prayed softly, giving thanks for the triumph and asking for wisdom for the days ahead. The wind swept through the valley, carrying with it the faint sound of distant trumpets, as if heaven itself was still rejoicing. The firelight flickered across the tents, and the people of God rested in safety. That day the name of Joshua became known throughout Canaan, and all the nations heard that the Lord himself fought for Israel. The fear that had once filled the hearts of the enemies was now replaced by reverence. Jericho had fallen, but the purpose of God remained unshaken. That victory was not only the beginning of the conquest of the Promised Land, it was the dawn of a new spiritual chapter for the chosen people. Faith had become obedience, and obedience had become victory. And as the fire faded over the ruins, the heavens seemed to whisper the same eternal truth. When God goes before you, the fall of Jericho was more than a military victory. It was an eternal testimony of what happens when the people of God choose to obey before they understand. No human sword ever touched the stones of that city. and yet everything collapsed before the faith of a people who had learned to wait for heaven's timing. Jericho represented much more than a physical fortress. It was the symbol of human pride, self-sufficiency, and resistance against the divine will. Its towering walls spoke of false security, but behind them was a hardened heart. And it was precisely there, in the place where sin had become routine, that God revealed his power to restore and to purify. The same God who brought down the walls of Jericho is still at work today. The barriers that surround us may not be made of stone, but they are often stronger than any wall. They are walls of fear, of doubt, of guilt, and of sin. Yet when the heart chooses to trust, the impossible once again yields to the divine presence. The Christian writer Ellen White explains that the obedience born of faith was the secret of Israel's victory. And that remains the secret of every spiritual triumph. God does not ask for strategies. He asks for trust. He does not seek displays of strength, but hearts willing to march even in silence until his command comes. The sound of Jericho's trumpet still echoes through history as a reminder that the power of God does not fade with time. The one who opened the sea, who brought down walls, and who guided Israel into Canaan is the same who guides the steps of all who choose to follow him today. Perhaps there is something in your life that feels impossible to overcome. But if God was able to bring down the walls of an entire city with the breath of his word, he is also able to break down everything that stands in the way of his purpose for you. So, trust him, to march in silence, to obey in faith, and to wait on the Lord. These are still the paths to victory. If this message has spoken to your heart, subscribe, share this video, and stay with us. May your faith remain strong until the day when the walls of this world will also fall before the glory of God. The little light, bringing hope, faith,